Order. I'm going to ask the question on behalf of Clive Betts, who's got the urgent question, and then I will go up to Clive Betts. Minister, to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I congratulate the honourable gentleman, the member and chair of the Select Committee, for securing this urgent question, which is of huge interest and concern to many of our constituents up and down the country. Mr. Speaker, the question of who pays for remediation works is a key issue for the government and many of our constituents. We have been clear that leaseholders should not have to worry about the cost of fixing historical safety defects in their buildings that they did not cause. Tests have shown clearly that aluminium composite material, the kind of cladding found on Grenfell Tower, to be the most dangerous form of cladding material. And we continue to engage with building owners, regulators and the wider industry to ensure it is removed from high-rise residential buildings as quickly as possible. ACM remediation costs are being funded through a number of sources, including warranties, building owners and developers. We have also provided £600 million to fund the removal of ACM where funding has been a key barrier to remediation. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has also allocated a further £1 billion to be spent on removing other types of unsafe cladding over the present financial year. It's important to remember that this is a multi-year problem. Remediation work cannot be done overnight, and it must be done properly so that it makes buildings and residents safe. And that forms part of the ongoing discussion that my right honourable friend has with other government departments. However, Mr. Speaker, I'm clear, and I hope that this House is also clear, that public funding does not absolve the industry from taking responsibility. We expect developers, investors and building owners who have the means to pay to cover remediation costs themselves without passing on costs to leaseholders. But we recognise there are cases where this may not be possible, and cases where there may be wider costs relating to historic defects. The Government is determined to identify suitable financial solutions and remove barriers to remediation. The Government has asked Michael Wade to accelerate his work with leaseholders and the financial sector to develop proposals to protect leaseholders from costs of remediating historic defects wherever possible. But we must also ensure that the bill does not fall wholly on taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, we will update leaseholders on this work before the Building Safety Bill, which has just completed its pre-legislative scrutiny, is introduced to Parliament.
We're now going up to South Yorkshire to Clive Betts for his urgent question. Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to ask my urgent question. The Select Committee, the Housing Committee and Local Government Select Committee, has just carried out pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft Building Safety Bill. Let me say in general, this is a very welcome bill to implement the recommendations of the Hackett report post-Grenfell. However, clause 89 of the bill contains provision for leaseholders to be charged a building safety charge. This could cover future costs, but it could also be used to recover the costs of historic defects, such as the removal of dangerous cladding, and that's the concern. Therefore, I've got a number of questions to the Minister. First of all, will he confirm very clearly and straightforwardly, as was the government's policy for some time, that leaseholders should not have to pay any of the costs of removing dangerous cladding from their homes? They bought their properties in good faith, they haven't done anything wrong, and they shouldn't be financially distressed as a result. If the Minister thinks that leaseholders should have to pay something, and the Building Safety Minister said to the Select Committee he thought that an affordable amount was reasonable, how would he define an affordable amount? The Building Safety Minister said something that didn't bankrupt an individual. However, if leaseholders are not going to pay, and I hope the Minister will confirm that, I accept that he should pursue developers and freeholders and others. But in the meantime, if developers have gone out of business or are refusing to pay, does he accept, at least in the interim, the government is going to have to step in and fund all the costs? If he accepts that, then does he accept that the £1.6 billion so far made available to remove dangerous cladding will be totally inadequate? The Select Committee heard that to make all high-rise buildings totally safe and remove all defects, the total bill could be as high as £15 billion, and leaseholders should not have to pay that. Finally, I say to the Minister, does he accept, without assurances on these points, many people are going to have a very miserable Christmas, trapped in properties they can't sell, properties they often can't insure, trapped in properties where they're having to pay for waking watchers, and wondering how on earth they're going to pay the bills that could arrive on their doormat at any time?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his question and also for welcoming the proposals that we have tabled in the Building Safety Bill. He asks a number of important questions. He first of all asks whether the building safety charge will be retrospective. We envisage that the building safety charge is there to cover ongoing costs that leaseholders may have to pay for legal costs, for building safety inspections and the like. In the proposals that we have tabled, we have said that the Secretary of State will be able to prescribe costs to ensure that unfair building safety charge costs do not fall unreasonably on the leaseholder. We will, of course, look very carefully at the 80-page report that the Select Committee have produced. I think there are somewhere north of 40 recommendations in the report, and we want to look at it carefully and considerately because we recognise it forms an important part of our answer to the challenge of building safety. And I hope that we can develop a cross-party approach to our further scrutiny of that bill when it comes before Parliament. He also asked me, Mr. Speaker, whether leaseholders will pay any costs at all. The point of introducing £1.6 billion of public money is to make sure that in those buildings which are most at risk and where there is no means to pay, the state does step in and support those leaseholders. But fundamentally, we expect developers, owners, to step up and execute their responsibility to pay where buildings have been defective. I cannot say, Mr. Speaker, that there will not be some costs at some point related to some defect in historic building safety that will not fall upon the leaseholder. But we want to make sure through the public money that we are spending and also through the work of Michael Wade that we find innovative solutions to make sure that such costs are as minimal as possible. Because we cannot write an open cheque on behalf of the taxpayer. That would send the wrong signal to developers and those who are responsible for these buildings that they do not have to pay because the taxpayer will. He asks me about my noble friend, the Building Safety Minister in the other place. I can tell him that Lord Greenhalgh is working round the clock to find solutions to the challenges that face leaseholders up and down the country. He is determined with the work that he is doing with insurers, with developers, with the financial services sector to make sure that we come up with those solutions. And I look forward to working with him closely as the bill which he will introduce to Parliament works its way through both houses of Parliament.
We now can follow House of Peter Bottom.
Mr. Speaker, it's on record that I'm a leaseholder, but I'm not affected by these proposals or problems. The Honourable Ellesmere Porton Neston and I chair the all-party group. We would like to give our support to the work of the Select Committee, who in this report, as in their previous one on lease renters, have really laid out starkly what are the problems of some particular tenants. Social tenants don't have to pay. Ordinary tenants don't have to pay. It's the leaseholder tenants who've been lumbered with unimaginable anxiety and costs beyond the possible chance of paying. And until we get a full grip, not just on the very high buildings, and not just on the aluminium cladding, but on all the problems, including the developers who use wood for balconies in ways which were against the house builders' regulations, we're going to be left with a frozen part of the housing market in every single one of our constituencies in this country. So can I put to my honourable friend that we're grateful for the work he and his colleagues have done, that he should go on paying attention, as I think Lord Greenhalgh has, to the work of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, who are the first campaigning charity to get a grip of the scale of the problem. And can he also say a word about the costs of waking watches, which are going on too long at too high costs? Done.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his contribution and for his ongoing interest and commitment to this very important area of work. As I said in my earlier remarks, Mr. Speaker, we do not want leaseholders to carry the burden of these costs. That's why we're working with Michael Wade, who has a 40-odd-year history in the insurance market, to find innovative solutions to what is a very complicated problem. It's why we've also put aside a significant amount of public money in this financial year to remediate those buildings which are most at risk, where the owners have no other means of paying. He also asks me about Waking Watch. We've published data on the costs of Waking Watch, so leaseholders are able to see the relative differences charged by Waking Watch providers. It's entirely wrong that some providers charge so much, and I would point leaseholders to that data so they can better understand where they may get better service. They may also know that if they install alarm systems within 7 weeks, those alarm systems can pay for themselves and obviate the need for Waking Watch.
Shadow Minister Mike Ames.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The HCLG scrutiny report of the Building Safety Bill, published today, makes for powerful yet sobering reading, not just for members across this chamber today, but importantly, the hundreds of thousands of leaseholders that are now trapped in this living nightmare, left to foot the cost of a broken building safety system that they did not create. Before this, we had another very powerful HCLG committee report, a PAC report, and a National Audit Office report that have repeatedly made it clear that well over 3 years on from Grenfell, when 72 people lost their lives, the government needs to step up and step in to make buildings safe with a greater sense of urgency. There's too many aspects of the building safety crisis to mention. The cost of remediation being passed to leaseholders, and yes, the interim costs such as waking watch, the snail's pace of the work, and the other safety issues such as fire breaks and wooden balconies not covered by the funding, and the lack of prioritisation according to risks than simply height of the buildings, and the ongoing saga of the external wall survey forms, despite this weekend's botched announcement by the Secretary of State. How many reports, Mr. Speaker, are we going to need? By my count, the government has promised 11 times in this chamber and beyond that leaseholders should be protected from the costs of remediation. And now we witness minister after minister shifting sand, referring to affordable costs put on the shoulders of leaseholders enshrined in the draft Building Safety Bill, the Building Safety Charge, Clause 89 of the bill. It's there in black and white for people to see. Can the Minister tell me and the House what additional invoice paid in 28 days he defines as affordable, or the dispatch box today referred to reasonable? Please answer that question. Finally, can the Minister explain why those companies and developers that knowingly engineered false test results for insulation and cladding products then riddle thousands of homes with flammable materials are getting away scot-free?
Mr. Speaker, I'm obliged to the honourable gentleman for his questions. It is not true for him to say that leaseholders are being left to foot the bill. He knows full well, the House knows full well, that the taxpayer is spending £1.6 billion in this financial year to help remediate those buildings which are most at risk, where the owners are unable to pay. And of course, those discussions across government are ongoing. We keep the situation under review. But I remind the House, it is not fair simply to place such a burden on the taxpayer. Developers and owners must step up and play their part. He raises the question of the external wall system one firm, which he will know is a form produced by RICS. It's not a government form. I'm pleased that as a result of the negotiations undertaken by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State and Lord Greenhalgh, the EWS form will no longer be necessary for those buildings which are not clad. The industry has made that clear, and that will be to the benefit of something like 450,000 leaseholders. But there is more to do, and we will continue to do it. He asks me about what is affordability. Well, affordability is a very subjective matter because, of course, what is affordable to one person is not affordable to another. We want to make sure, as a result of the work that my noble friend is doing with the financial services sector and with the insurance sector, that we come up with appropriate and innovative solutions to make sure that unfair costs do not fall on leaseholders for defects which may be identified down the line. He also, I think, referred to commentary about lies told about fire safety tests. I entirely agree that was wrong. It was outrageous, and where firms have been proven to lie, they must, of course, receive the full force of the law.
Can I just suggest we have got 62 people to get through, so I am concerned. I do recognise that everybody needs to get in because they've all got personal circumstances. So if we can help each other, it might just get us through. Nikki Aiken.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst I welcome that a number of responsible property owners have taken the necessary steps supported by government funding to remove dangerous cladding from their buildings, leaseholders and residents of Paddington Walk in my constituency are still under pressure from their buildings owner, European Land, to pay for the works required to remove ACM cladding. As those residents said to me in an email sent this morning, manufacturers are responsible for defective kettles or cars. Why is it different for the most expensive purchase anyone will ever make in their lives? Does my right honourable friend agree with me that given the billions of pounds being available by the government, it is now inexcusable that there are still many building owners who have failed to remove dangerous cladding and are still trying to pass the cost, indeed trying to pass the buck, to leaseholders who have suffered enough in this living nightmare?
Mr. Speaker, I quite agree with my honourable friend. The buck ought to lie with the owners, their developers, or the warranty holder. She will know that we've spent a great deal of public money to remediate those buildings that are most in need of it, as I've described, but the responsibility of the developers, and there are some very good developers out there, must be fully understood by us in this House, by them as an industry, to remediate buildings that need it and to restore the reputation of their sector.
The SNP spokesperson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate the Chairman of the Select Committee for securing today's urgent question. Despite the building safety programme only applying in England and Wales, its advice is still being used by insurance companies and mortgage providers in Scotland to guide the decisions. This is leading to many people north of the border ending up in the same position as those south of the border, essentially mortgage prisoners and having their properties valued as worthless. And the Minister knows that this isn't just an issue of commonality for buildings over 18 metres, it includes those under 18 metres too. So what measures will the Government be bringing forward, particularly with an eye to tomorrow's spending review? What discussions has he had with lenders and insurance companies to make clear that applying this process to Scotland is unfair? Will he agree to meet with the delegation of Scottish MPs to look more closely at the issue impacting our constituents in this regard? And finally, the problems for leaseholders arising from the 18-metre rule raise the question of why the archaic and often unjust institution of leaseholding is continuing in England at all. Might this therefore be an opportunity to follow Scotland's example and abolish this outdated practice and the negative consequences that are so common with it?
Yeah, here.
I'm obliged to the honourable gentleman, Mr Speaker, for his questions. I'll touch on 2 points that he raised. He is right that the financial services sector has commonalities throughout the United Kingdom, not simply in England, but in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland also. That's why the Secretary of State and Lord Greenhalgh have held a series of meetings with the UK finance and other components of the financial services sector. It's why an agreement has been reached that EWS1 form should not apply to buildings without cladding, which, as I say, will help 450,000 or so leaseholders around the country. And there is more work to do, and I trust that the Scottish financial sector will take note of the advances that we have made very recently in England and which we will continue to make. He raises the question of 18 metres. Well, of course, that is the guidance provided to us by Judith Hackett and her committee, and we are following that guidance. He also refers to leasehold reform. Leasehold reform white paper will be forthcoming. Perhaps we may, at that time, be able to debate the advantages and disadvantages of the Scottish system and see where we're able to learn from them, and possibly they're able to learn from us.
So, David.
A number of constituencies in a low-rise block of flats in Southend West have been unable to get their properties insured because of cladding issues. It would cost £400,000 to remove the cladding and their service charges will escalate. Will my honourable friend please reiterate again the principle that those costs should not be passed on to tenants or leaseholders?
I'm happy to reiterate that point to my honourable friend, Mr Speaker. My noble friend Lord Greenhalgh has had a series of meetings with the insurance industry to make sure they fully understand and take on board that point. He will continue to do so, as my right honourable friend will continue to doubtfully campaign on behalf of his constituents.
David Lammet.
I've got to say to the Minister that I never dreamed that 3.5 years after my friend Khadija Say died with her mother in Grenfell Tower, that I would be here begging him to sort this problem out. I've got over 1,000 residents in the Tottenham Hale village in my constituency, a development built by Bellway Homes, who made 500 million profits in 2018, another 500 million profits in 2019, and has showed complete disregard for my constituents living in these buildings with combustible cladding. What is he going to do about these leaseholders in this situation when it's clear that his building safety fund is inadequate to meet the task? Will he meet with me and my constituents so we can sort this 3.5 years after the government promised it would be fixed?
Mr Speaker, I'm obliged to the right honourable gentleman for his question, and I sympathise with him for his personal loss and the loss of many of his friends and associates at Grenfell Tower. He asks what is being done to accelerate the pace of remediation in London, where there have been challenges which are unique to our capital. My noble friend Lord Greenhalgh convened a summit of the London Mayor, the London Fire Brigade, back in September to address an action plan to accelerate the work of London remediation. There was a further progress tracking meeting last month, and there are case conference meetings to address specific buildings in the capital and beyond. I'd remind him that the £1 billion that we put aside for non-ACM cladding had something like 2,700 applications. We've worked through those. We have now agreed a significant number of them meet criteria, and I think the first funding of those applications is about to begin, and I'm confident that it will be fully allocated by the end of the financial year in 2021, for which the money was made available.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an issue of huge concern to many of my constituents in Portishead, and it must be an absolute principle that leaseholders must be protected from the cost of remediation for safety issues that were not their fault. I welcome the government's support and their approach. A £1.6 billion taxpayers' commitment is huge, but the taxes of working families up and down the country should not be used to absolve developers, insurers and owners from their proper responsibilities. When will my honourable friend come forward and set out how these responsibilities will be enforced?
Well, I'm obliged, Mr. Speaker, to my right honourable friend for his question. He's absolutely right. As I said in my earlier remarks, the responsibility, first and foremost, must fall squarely on the developers of these properties, their owners and warranty holders. There are some good developers who have worked hard to remediate ACM cladding, and something like 50% of the buildings which have had ACM cladding remediated have been done so and are being done so by the private sector. Pemberston, Mace and Peabody, Barrett Developments and others are all working to remediate their buildings. But we've been clear that those that do not, such as those referred to by my honourable friend, the member for the City of Westminster, must recognise that they will receive the full force of the law. And from December, I can tell the House, those responsible for buildings where remediation is not forecast to start by the end of 2020 will be publicly named as a further incentive for them to get going.
Farron.
Yeah, it would be an inexcusable outrage if the costs of making buildings safe in the light of the Grenfell tragedy fell in practice not on the developers or the governments whose disregard of safety led to that tragedy, but instead fell on the innocent leaseholders. Yet, in effect, that is the government's default position, as people are left with homes they can't afford to make safe and indeed homes they cannot sell. So will the government accept the Lord's Amendment 13 of the Fire Safety Bill in the name of my honourable friends, the Baroness Pinnock and the Lord Shipley, in order to stop this injustice?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman asks about an amendment which is being sent down to us from the other place. We will, of course, examine very closely the wording of that amendment, but my understanding is that it is a defective one, notwithstanding the issues that he raises and the concerns that he properly posits about leaseholders footing the bill. And I hope I've been clear to the House about my view on that. But my understanding of this particular amendment is that it would be retrospective, which raises all sorts of legal challenges. It would also mean that building owners would be responsible for normal wear and tear of buildings, which I'm sure the whole House would accept would not be appropriate. So we will look very closely at the amendment, but I don't think that I can say at this stage that we can support it.
Since I spoke about this issue soon after being elected, it affected one tower in my constituency. Since then, it's ballooned as a problem, and every week there seems to be more of my constituents being dragged into this. I agree that ultimately responsibility should lie with a freeholder, but the reality is, whilst the government has that debate and that dispute with a freeholder, it's the leaseholders in the middle who have got this uncertainty hanging over them. Just last week, Cardinal Lofts at Ipswich Waterfront, they were all notified by quite a distant building manager that they had to pay £300 a month for waking watch. Added to that, at a time of uncertainty, and all of them are having of employment because of the pandemic, it is completely wrong. I'm glad at some of the support provided by government, but we need far more certainty far soon, will the Minister meet with me and colleagues to talk in detail about the timeline for providing that certainty?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has raised this particular issue with me before. I know he has campaigned hard and long on it since his election just 11 months ago. I am very happy to meet him and discuss the issues that he raised. The issue of Waking Watch has been raised by other members. As I said, we want to make sure that leaseholders are aware of Waking Watch costs and the opportunities to mitigate them. It's also the reason why we want developers to get on and remediate. It's also the reason why we have put £1.6 billion of taxpayers' money aside to make sure that we can remediate those buildings where owners cannot. So the Waking Watch issue becomes moot.
Let's head to Eltham with Clive Efford. Clive Efford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an absolute disgrace that 3.5 years on, we still have people living in properties where they don't know whether they're safe, and others that can't sell because they cannot get external wall survey certificates. Now, I'm told by surveyors that would willingly carry out this work that they can't do so because they can't afford the huge premiums that are being charged by insurance companies. And this is leading to a huge backlog in this area of work, which is essential that we get it moving. So can I ask the Minister what he's going to do about this, and whether he would consider paying these premiums so that we can remove this backlog and start to get some idea of what the problem is that we're facing?
Mr. Speaker, I'm obliged to the honourable gentleman for his question. He asks what we're doing to speed up the process of surveying. We are making more professionals available to undertake assessments of EWS systems. We're spending something like £700,000 to fund the training of those assessors. We'll produce about 2,000 of them over the next 6 months, and that should help speed up the process to which the honourable gentleman refers.
Chris Grayling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency, the biggest concern for residents has been the inappropriate application of these rules in the EWS form to much lower-rise buildings than were ever envisaged, and the resulting problems that have been created for them in selling flats, moving flat and so forth. I very much welcome the announcements made by my right honourable friend last weekend. I'm very grateful to him for that. Could I ask him to keep up the pressure on the different professionals and organisations involved to make sure that this problem really does disappear? You know, these homeowners should not be subject to pressures because of something that is not designed for their kind of property.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend can ask, and we will.
There we are. Let's head to Greater Manchester with Andrew Gwynn. Andrew.
Thank you. I often wonder how government ministers would react if they received a letter, often out of the blue, saying the cost to make their home safe far exceeded their annual salary, sometimes by multiple amounts. We know over 2,800 have applied for the Building Safety Fund. So can the Minister inform the House how many have been allowed to proceed to a formal application so far, and how much has actually been paid out of this fund to date?
Mr. Speaker, I can tell the honourable gentleman that 2,704 applications were received. A significant number of them, I regret to tell the House, were not sufficiently fulsome to allow an immediate assessment, but over 100 of them have been assessed successfully to move on to the next stage. The first tender for payment has been agreed, and I'm confident that by the end of the financial year for which this money was set aside, it will have been fully allocated. Remediation work will have begun.
Let's head to North Thanet with Sir Roger Gale. Sir Roger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his opening remarks, my right honourable friend said that people should not be required to pay for faults that they did not cause, and he's absolutely right. Further to the point raised by the father of the house, I have in my constituency one block that has social housing, private rented accommodation, full and shared leaseholders. Can my right honourable friend assure the House that the leaseholder element of those will not ever be faced with a disproportionate bill that will be effectively paying for those who don't pay at all?
Again, I'm obliged to my honourable friend for his question. As I said earlier on, Mr. Speaker, I cannot say that there will not be some cost which may occur at some point to leaseholders for historical defects work that may be undertaken. But we do want to make sure, as a result of the work that Michael Wade is doing with the financial services and others, that any such costs are fair and reasonable and can be carried. That's why we put aside also that £1.6 billion to make sure that the cost of cladding remediation for cladding such as ACM and for high pressure laminate, for example, can be funded by the taxpayer where the developers are not able to do so. So the cost does not fall upon the leaseholder.
Speaker, we've already heard about the difficulties leaseholders have had when they are seeking to sell with the backlog of the EWS1 form. At the weekend, the Minister's colleague claimed that his proposal to remove the requirement for this certification from properties without cladding had been cleared and had the backing of mortgage lenders. In fact, the UK Finance and the Building Societies Association both said they didn't back this scheme, hadn't been consulted. It didn't solve anything and left 1.9 million homeowners in the lurch. Can the Minister tell us whether those leaseholders that do not have cladding will be required to have the certification or not, and whether his proposal now has the backing of finance lenders?
Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that those buildings which do not have cladding will not need an EWS1 form. There is clearly more work we need to do with the financial services sector to advance the issues that have arisen with the EWS1 form. But as a result of the negotiations and the agreements made over the weekend, we anticipate that something like 450,000 leaseholders will no longer need to use an EWS1 form.
Dr. Hendon with Dr. Matthew Offord. Dr. Offord.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to press the Minister on that specific point. Can he confirm whether UK Finance has officially acknowledged that leaseholders of residential properties without external cladding do not need to provide an EWS1 form to finance, remortgage or sell their properties? And where can my constituents view that confirmation?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said to the Honourable Lady previously, my understanding is the industry has confirmed that the EWS1 form will not be necessary for buildings which do not have cladding. And as I'm saying it from the dispatch box, I would imagine that is the view of the government.
17 withdrawn. Dean Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the EWS1 form measures as they will have a real impact and provide certainty for many in my constituency. However, there are still a number of Watford residents, especially in places like Outlook Place, for example, who are currently finding it difficult to sell or remortgage their homes. So what reassurances can my right honourable friend offer to those living in buildings with cladding that are under 18 metres? Thank you.
Well, I'm obliged to my honourable friend, who I know has been campaigning in Watford long and hard on this particular issue. As I said, we have, as a result of some considerable and lengthy negotiations with the financial services sector, agreed that EWS1 forms will not be necessary where buildings are for sale, where they are not clad in the way that some buildings which are in grave difficulty are. That will help 450,000 people around the country, a number of whom I suspect will be his constituents. There is more work to do on this matter, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to undertake it.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I need to declare my interest in that I am a leaseholder in an affected block, but in my case, my developer is paying for the full remediation works. The Minister must acknowledge this is one of the biggest consumer and safety failures in a generation. Yeah. And for all that I chair the Public Accounts Committee, and we've published a report on this issue, and I watch taxpayers' money very closely, surely the government needs to step up, just as it did when the former Secretary of State signed a ministerial direction sanctioning the expenditure of millions of pounds because he knew that it would take too long to go through the legal process to track down the actual owners of buildings for the most dangerous cladding. The government needs to step up. We need 10 times the amount that's been pledged. Surely the Minister must recognise this. Too many leaseholders are trapped and will never be able to move.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I know that she is a very considerate and assiduous chair of the Public Accounts Committee. The government, though, Mr. Speaker, has stepped up. It's why we put £600 million on the table to remediate ACM-clad buildings, and something like 79% of those have now either completed or have begun their remediation. 97% of those buildings which are social housing buildings have had that remediation completed. It's why we stepped up again with £1 billion to remediate buildings through the Building Safety Fund which have other non-ACM style dangerous cladding. But we must not absolve the responsibility of the developers, of the owners, to make sure that remediation takes place in the buildings for which they are responsible. We work with them to make sure that happens whilst we keep the general situation under review.
Mr. Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the additional money for training for assessors, because I do understand from industry that this is a very important issue in terms of several of the delays. However, I am frustrated that 3.5 years on from the appalling Grenfell tragedy, which happened in my constituency, that we have many outstanding issues still. What assurance can my right honourable friend give me that we will not be having the same conversation in 6 or 12 months' time? And are there any interim measures that we can put in place to support leaseholders?
Again, I'm obliged to the Honourable Lady, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the very unique challenge that she has as the Member of Parliament for Kensington. As I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, the £700,000 of public money that we're putting aside to support the training of assessors will deliver something like 2,000 assessors, clearly qualified assessors, who will be able to undertake the assessment work over the next 12 months. So I trust that will also be a means by which we will not be having this conversation again any time in the future. But the public money that we've set aside beyond that, £1.6 billion, is also designed to make sure that the worst buildings, the most dangerous buildings, are dealt with quickly and effectively, and the conversations that we have ongoing with developers and with owners to make sure they step up to the plate, I hope and trust will mean that very, very soon we will remediate all those buildings which are affected, and we'll be able to see value and trust restored to those buildings and to the development sector.
John Warren.
My constituent is a leaseholder, and one of, I think it was 2,700 blocks that the Minister says has applied for the Building Safety Fund, which has approximately enough money to remedy about 600 blocks. She doesn't know if her flat is safe, she can't sell it, and she doesn't know how much her liabilities may be. Now, the Minister can talk about finding innovative solutions, but it is 3.5 years since Grenfell, and we still don't see builders or owners or developers paying to remedy. So will he guarantee to my constituent that she will not have to be liable, she will not have to pay for these costs? And does he agree with me that this is just one more example that shows that the leasehold system is broken and needs to be reformed?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the leasehold system and its reform will form part of a government white paper and separate debates in this chamber, and I'm sure that she will play her part in those. It is not true to say that developers and others are not funding remediation. As I described, firms like Pemberton, Mason Peabody, Barrett, Legal & General, I think, are all stepping forward with funds to remediate buildings for which they're responsible, resulting in something like 50% of ACM-clad buildings being remediated by the private sector. I don't know the specific issues of the buildings in her constituency to which she refers. I'm very happy to talk to her separately about them. I am confident that the £1 billion of public money that we've set aside through the Building Safety Bill will be allocated by the end of this financial year, as we said it would, and that remediation of those non-ACM buildings will begin.
Kevin Holland, right?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I draw the House's attention to my register of members' interests. In many cases, there are insurmountable legal problems trying to charge building owners and freeholders for these sums. Developers will often point the finger elsewhere. We know that responsibility lies with developers and installers, with, in many cases, the manufacturers of insulation and cladding, and, let's be honest, with successive governments for their approach to building regulations, which must be described as ambiguous, but it cannot be left at the door of the leaseholders. Is it not right now that the government will step in, increase the Building Safety Fund, get the work done, and claim back these monies wherever possible, from whoever possible, but in where it cannot, in a cross-sector levy?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is an expert in this field, and I pay tribute to the work that he has undertaken. Mr. Wade, our advisory, is working hard with us, with the sector, to develop solutions which will provide help and support to leaseholders. In the meantime, as I say, the government has stepped up and has provided a significant amount of public money to remediate those buildings which are most in need of it and where there is another means of paying. But it must be right that we ask developers and those responsible for these buildings to pay. To signal that the state will simply step in and sub them will not encourage them to do the right thing, and it is for developers, owners and warranty suppliers in the first instance to make sure the buildings for which they're responsible are remediated.
Lizzie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Leaseholders in St Albans are already facing estimated bills of between £50,000 and £120,000 each for fixing safety defects in their buildings that they did not cause. Now, these are not bills that are in the far-off distant future. These are costs that are being passed on to leaseholders right now, and through increased service charges. And in the last 3 years, leaseholders in St Albans have seen their service charges rise from under £1,000 a year to £6,000 per year. Some of my residents cannot afford to pay these bills anymore, and that is going to affect their ability to continue working in some professions. So will the government get a grip and take some urgent action to make sure that leaseholders will no longer have to pay for, like they are already doing, to make sure that leaseholders do not foot the bill for these costs?
Mr. Speaker, I'm obliged to the honourable lady. She is right. She will recognise that there are many cases where leasehold agreements allow the building owners, the freeholders or their managing agents, to pass on remediation costs to the leaseholders of individual flats. And that's why we have instituted the work of Michael Wade to ensure that leaseholders are protected from any charges for historic remediation that are unfair. The fundamental responsibility and the first responsibility must lie with the developers and the building owners and the warranty holders for the remediation of those buildings, not the leaseholders.
Teresa Villas.
Can I thank the government for the substantial investment in tackling this problem, including for the social sector, and will he encourage housing associations that have been funded to do this work to get it done as quickly as possible? That's the best thing to do to keep people safe, but also it's really tough on tenants living effectively in a building site for months on end, as has been the case in Desmond House and East Barnet in my constituency.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend is a doughty campaigner for her constituents in Chipping Barnet, and I will do exactly as she advises.
We now go to Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are hundreds of families in Walthamstow who have finally managed to get their foot on the property ladder through shared ownership, and now, as a result of this crisis, find themselves in properties that are almost worthless and facing huge bills. But will the Minister reconsider the decision to exclude those bills that were incurred before the 11th of March? Because many of them have already tried to do the right thing and already incurred huge costs to themselves through the remediation works. Surely we shouldn't penalise those people who tried to act promptly on this matter.
I'm obliged to the Honourable Lady. The decision of the government was to make sure that those buildings which were most in need of remediation and where the owners could not pay should be, as it were, first in the queue for government help. But we want to work with the sector, with the leaseholder community, with Michael Wade, our advisor, to find solutions which will ensure that unfair bills do not fall upon leaseholders who are not responsible for the troubles that they face.
We now go to Marco Longhi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I should draw your attention to my register of interests as I ask this question. As a landlord myself, I make it my utmost priority to make sure my tenants are safe in their homes. What steps is my right honourable friend taking to ensure all landlords are taking their duties seriously and acting on their tenants' concerns?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I can tell my honourable friend that we have written to all those responsible for buildings, including their owners, where remediation has not started, to remind them of their responsibilities and our expectation that remediation will begin by the end of the year. My honourable friend, the Noble Lord Greenhalgh, has convened roundtable meetings with owners and with local authority leaders to address the challenges that they face locally, and we've made it clear that from December, those responsible for buildings where remediation has not started and is not forecast to start by the end of this year will be publicly named. Those are active steps we're undertaking to remind landlords and owners of their responsibilities.
Ruth Catherine.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In October, over 1,000 of my constituents, leaseholders, shed owners, tenants and students, were asked to leave the Paragon estate in Brentford within 7 days because the current owners, Notting Hill Genesis, found significant fire safety and structural issues. These were unrelated to flammable cladding because that had already been removed 2 years ago. In September 2019, Richmond House in Worcester Park, a 4-storey block of only 23 leasehold flats, was destroyed by fire in 11 minutes. Both estates were developed by the Berkeley Group and both had the same significant fire safety defects. The Sunday Times said, the week before last, the scandal over building safety spreads far beyond dangerously clad tower blocks and could affect 4 million people. What is the government doing right now to protect all those at risk of dying at home caused by failures in the building safety regime?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Building Safety Fund was designed specifically to deal with the removal of unsafe non-ACM cladding where the buildings are over 80 metres and where materials, even before the combustible cladding ban was put in place in 2018, under statutory guidance, should not have been used on high-rise buildings. So that fund is available. As I described to the House, it is already being dispersed around the country and will be completed by the end of this financial year. We will continue to work with the financial sector, as I described, using Michael Wade. We'll continue to work with developers to make sure that the responsibility of those developers is executed and support for leaseholders is provided. As to the specifics of the case that she raises, I'm not aware of it, but I'm always very happy to discuss it with her out with the Chamber.
We now go to Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as a member of the HCLG Select Committee, I've had the opportunity of scrutinising the draft safety bill. The report that we published today has the unanimous support on a cross-party basis. And I would urge my right honourable friend and his colleagues to look at it in very great detail indeed. I do not expect, and it would be unreasonable to expect, an immediate reaction today following the publication. However, during the course of that inquiry, that has caused a concern about costs being passed on to leaseholders from Lord Greenhalgh's evidence given to us. Now, I know my right honourable friend has said that the proposed amendments to the fire safety bill are defective in some form, but could he commit on behalf of the government to make clear that the government will ensure that it will be illegal for the cost of remediating unsafe cladding on buildings be passed on to leaseholders in any shape or form?
Minister.
I'm obliged to my honourable friend. I can guarantee to him that we will look very closely at the report. As I said, there are something like 80 pages, 40 odd recommendations. I shall look very closely at, I think, pages 22 to 39, which may also include reference to other proposals which have come from another place.
Patrick Grady.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as my honourable friend says, this isn't a problem that stops at the border. I have constituents in the Partick area and elsewhere who are trapped in houses that they can't sell and can't get fixed as a result of advice designed for an English model of ownership and management that doesn't apply in Scotland. When did he last engage with Scottish Government counterparts on this, and when will he next engage with them? And will he respond to the request from honourable friend to meet with a delegation of us from Scotland to discuss how this particularly affects our constituencies?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we discuss a range of issues with our colleagues in the Scottish Government, and officials discuss with officials in the usual way all of the time. I'm very happy to discuss with him any particular arrangements that he may have to raise, and I will also make sure that any such issues that he raise are raised with my noble friend Lord Greenhalgh.
Anthony Higginbottom.
Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst discussions take place with property developers and freeholders about who will fund the cost of these, we should never forget that there are leaseholders and tenants living in these buildings. So could the Minister set out what steps are being taken to keep those people safe, living in the fear that they have?
Well, I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the honourable gentleman. We have put a great deal of public money aside to make sure that buildings which need remediation, which have no other means of making them safe quickly, are made safe through the ACM fund and through the Building Safety Fund. We will continue to work closely with the industry to make sure that other buildings are remediated and made safe. And I look forward to further contributions from my honourable friend in that regard.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister answered a series of questions for me on this subject yesterday. They all contained the same formulation of words: to protect leaseholders from unaffordable costs. Does he realise that leaves leaseholders in limbo? And what he needs to do now, today, is either define what unaffordable means better than just below the bankruptcy threshold, which is the previous attempt by his colleague, or he needs to recommit to exempting leaseholders from those costs, and also exempting social landlords from those costs, because otherwise the cost falls not only on their leaseholders, but on their tenants as well.
Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said earlier, I cannot commit that there will be no costs that a leaseholder will ever have to pay with respect to some historic defect. We want to make sure through the Building Safety Fund and through the ACM Fund and through our work with developers and owners that those cladding issues that face so many people and which are the subject of great debate in this House, the costs of those are protected from leaseholders. He asks me about affordability. Well, that's a very subjective matter. What I would say to him is I would want to make sure through the funds that we've made available and through the work that Michael Wade is doing with the sector, that people are able to get on with their lives, restore value to their properties and live as normally as is possible without the spectre of costs hanging over them.
32 withdrawn, so Barry Gardner.
The NHBC blames the building control inspectors. The building control inspectors blame the construction company. The construction company blames the developer, and the developer blames the lack of proper regulation. What's clear is that nobody actually blames the thousands of leaseholders in my constituency who are now trapped in their homes paying for everyone else's mistakes. So will the Minister accept that the buck stops with him to get those who are responsible to pay up, if necessary with a windfall tax on the industry, to sort out the regulation and to keep my constituents safe and solvent? The buck stops with those who are responsible for the development of these buildings, the owners and the warranty holders, and that is what we are working to make sure that they do. Get them to pay.
Gareth Bacon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've been contacted by a number of constituents who are leaseholders in buildings under 18 metres in height that have cladding on them. They're unable to remortgage or to move home because mortgage providers are refusing to lend without an EWS1 form, and the freeholder hasn't provided it. Could my right honourable friend confirm whether or not an EWS1 form is required for buildings with cladding under 18 metres in height? And if not, will the government commit to reinforcing this message to mortgage providers so that my constituents can move on with their lives?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can certainly confirm that buildings which are without cladding should not have an EWS1 form applied to them. EWS1 forms can be applied in other egregious circumstances, and we are working with the sector to make sure that we obviate as far as is possible the responsibility of leaseholders to provide those forms. There is more work to be done to ensure that buildings can have their value restored to them, and so that people can move effectively without recourse to an EWS1 form.
We now go to Munira Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In my local authority of Richmond-upon-Thames, remediation work on less than 50% of buildings with dangerous cladding has either been started or completed. The leaseholders living in those buildings, such as the residents of Sandy Lane Estate in my constituency, are living at constant personal and financial risk. So could I press the Minister again? Will he, in the first instance, please commit to covering the costs of both the assessment and the remedial work, not just to keep my constituents safe, but leaseholders across the capital and the country, and claim the money back from freeholders and developers later?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said a moment ago, something like 79% of all identified high-rise ACM buildings have either completed or started their remediation. Something like 97% of social sector buildings have either completed or started their remediation. I know that there are specific challenges in London. That's why the Secretary of State and Lord Greenhalgh have undertaken roundtables with the Mayor, with the Fire Brigade and with the sector to ensure that the pace of acceleration is speeded. We want to make sure that this work is done. We will continue to work with the developer community and with leaseholders to make sure it is. And where necessary, as we've already demonstrated, public money will be spent, but in the first instance, the responsibility should fall upon those who built these buildings or who own them.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister is quite right that the buck should stop with those who are responsible, but for the 66 leaseholders in the landmark in Bexhill, their builder and developer have both gone out of business, and indeed the insurer is also not in business either. So ultimately, whilst the freeholder should of course be responsible, legally they may not be. So my real question to the Minister is what can be done to ensure that leaseholders are not responsible, and ultimately, if it's years of court action or bankruptcy for leaseholders, then surely we do need to look at an industry levy to make sure that the industry that's ultimately responsible carries the can.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the work of Michael Wade is designed to address some of the challenges that my honourable friend has raised. In the meantime, in the interim, that is why And I'm sorry to labour the point, but that is why we've put aside a very significant amount of public money to remediate those buildings which are most at risk of fire, which are most dangerous, and where there is no other means of the owner paying. So fundamentally, leaseholders in those circumstances are made safe. But the work of Mr Wade will focus particularly on the matters that my honourable friend raises.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The bottom line is this is a national scandal, and it's a UK-wide problem that's going to require UK-wide solutions, such as the Minister has described on the EWS1 forms that have affected my constituents. And I've been absolutely appalled by the utterly amoral behaviour of many of the developers and construction companies raking in billions while trying to dump the costs onto leaseholders in my constituency and so many others around this country. So can the Minister tell us, has he actually hauled in the likes of Redrow, Lang O'Rourke and Taylor Wimpey? What is he actually going to do to make them pay? He keeps saying they're responsible, ultimately responsible. What is he actually going to do to make them pay? Is it going to be a levy? Is it going to be some other sort of measure? And when are we going to see these innovative insurance products? Because the reality is that my constituents are paying thousands in increased premiums right now.
Well, I understand, Madam Deputy Speaker, the concerns of the honourable gentleman and the passion with which he brings to bear the concerns of his constituents. We have named and shamed those owners and developers that did not step up to the plate and properly remediate and quickly remediate ACM-clad buildings. We've made it clear that where we anticipate that remediation of other buildings will not have begun by the end of this year, we will name and shame them too. That is the work that Mr Wade is undertaking to develop the solutions that will mitigate the effect of any costs on leaseholders and to make sure that we draw this terrible situation to a reasonably quick and satisfactory conclusion. I think will answer some of the concerns that he has raised. We want to get on with this, we want to get on with it quickly, and that's the work that Mr Wade is undertaking.
We now go to Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And whilst I welcome the funding the government has made available to remove unsafe cladding, and I praise the owners who have stepped up to get this process underway, sadly, however, there are many who have not, leaving residents in Basildon trapped in homes they cannot sell. Further to the point just previously made, what more can the government do to force building owners, other than naming and shaming, to start the process of cladding removal and fund it where they can?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are a suite of measures that local authorities have with respect to enforcement, fines and the like that can be brought to bear to address the concerns, or some of the concerns, that my honourable friend has raised. But as I have said previously, and I shall say again, the work of Michael Wade, who is a very experienced player in the insurance sector with 40 years experience behind him, the work of Mr Wade to bring together the sector to find sensible and innovative solutions which will result in the costs that may fall to leaseholders being mitigated is the solution to this problem, without simply writing a blank cheque on behalf of taxpayers, which would send entirely the wrong message to the developers and the owners of these buildings, who are in the first place responsible for remediating the issues that they have caused.
Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I should make a declaration of interest that I am a leaseholder, although I'm personally unaffected by the matter in this debate. I have heard from a number of constituents who are in, or whose children are in, this position, however. Does the Minister agree that the principle is simple? They have purchased flats in good faith that have subsequently been shown to have been built potentially dangerously, and as rightly raised by my honourable friend, the member for Brentford and Isleworth, this extends far beyond combustible cladding. If they had bought some other item with inherent faults, they wouldn't be expected to pay for repairs. So these leaseholders shouldn't be liable for remedial works to make their homes safe, should they?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the actions that we are taking are designed to make sure that the Honourable Lady's constituents and those others around the country are not liable for the costs of cladding. I can't say to her that there will not be some costs that will fall upon leaseholders which has some connection with defects in their properties. But we are working hard with Mr. Wade and with others to make sure that we have solutions that will mitigate that effect, and we must make sure that the developers and the owners step up to the plate and remedy the situations that they have created, and where they cannot, thus far the government has demonstrated that it will step in and support the remediation of buildings, but we cannot and should not offer a blank cheque on behalf of taxpayers. The primary responsibility must reside with the developers who built these buildings.
We now go to Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome what my honourable friend is doing, particularly regarding fairness for leaseholders. But I ask him, what measures can he take to support Harlow locally to improve the quality of social housing, given the urgent need to ensure that our social housing stock is fit for purpose and we can build an even better Harlow for residents, ready for the 21st century and beyond?
Well, I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, to my right honourable friend who campaigns for Harlow like possibly no other colleague campaigns for any constituency in the country. He was integral to our work on space standards for upbuilding and also for ensuring that buildings have light in all habitable rooms. I point him in the direction, in answer to his question, to our affordable homes programme, £12.2 billion, which will deliver 180,000 new homes, affordable new homes, over the course of the next 5 years, and our reforms to the HRA, which allow local councils to more easily build their own social homes if they wish to. Two endeavours which Harlow may wish to pursue.
Greenwood.
Thank you. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been contacted by numerous leaseholders in my constituency who, through no fault of their own, are worried sick because they're being told that they need to pay thousands of pounds for essential fire safety works, including the removal of unsafe cladding. Some of them are vulnerable or on low incomes and all fear losing their home or being trapped in a financial nightmare. I think that the Minister agrees with the HCLG committee, saying that leaseholders should not be required to pay for the remediation of historical building safety defects. But what's his advice to my constituents who are receiving enormous service charge bills that they can't afford and should not be asked to pay?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. I entirely sympathise with the situation that her constituents and those of other honourable and right honourable colleagues across the House face. We are entirely cognisant of the fact that individual contracts, legal contracts between owners and leaseholders do allow owners to pass on costs to their leaseholders. That's why we've invited, or one of the reasons why we've invited, Michael Wade to do the work that he is doing. We will work as fast as we can to ensure that those solutions that we are working through are available to mitigate any costs that leaseholders may fear that they have to pay. And that is also why we'll continue to make public funds available, as we have through the ACM Fund and the Building Safety Fund, to remediate those buildings which are most in need and for which there is no other means of quick and easy remediation.
Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Leaseholders are not just living in limbo, as we have heard this afternoon, they are living in fear. And they are paying over the odds in insurance to live in fear, and they are paying, in some cases, well over £1,000 a year for waking watch charges. I recognise that my honourable friend has done an enormous amount of work on this, but can I please impress upon him the urgency, because people at this economic time simply cannot be affording those charges on an ongoing basis.
I entirely accept the points that my right honourable friend has made. We will continue to work with the insurance sector on the insurance challenges that leaseholders face, and with the financial services sector for the wider mortgage costs on challenges that leaseholders face, and we'll continue to work with developers to make sure that remediation takes place swiftly and effectively so this problem is resolved.
Stephen Timms.
Madam Deputy Speaker, will the Minister set out much more clearly the criteria for this much-needed grant funding? Residents at Waterside Park in my constituency are worried that their management company wants to apply to the Building Safety Fund, even though the development recently received a B1 rating, so remediation isn't required. Would such an application be appropriate?
Well, I'd point the right honourable gentleman to the specific criteria in the Building Safety Fund when it was published earlier this year. We will, as I say, and we'll say again, we'll work with Michael Wade to make sure that there are solutions to what is a very complicated issue. There may be more than one element to the package of solutions to resolve this challenge. I don't want to give a running commentary to the House on the progress of that work, but it is ongoing, and we hope that we can make some further concrete announcement soon to give succour to what the right honourable gentleman has said and reassurance to those others in the House.
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the £1 billion the Government has made available through the Building Safety Fund for the removal of unsafe non-ACM cladding. Is my right honourable friend able to update the House with regards to the number of applications to the fund, how quickly those can be reviewed and processed so the work can finally be done?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He campaigns hard and long for his constituents in Blackpool South. I can confirm that we have now advanced over 100 applications, and the first payment for work will be made imminently, and I'm confident that the full allocation of the £1 billion that the Chancellor made available in the budget earlier this year will be made by the end of this financial year, for which the money was made available.
We now go to Lynn Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Hundreds of constituents are affected by safety problems, from social housing tenants in Canning Town to leaseholders in Stratford. Those in the Prime Minister's flagship Olympic Park have had the Olympic dream turned into a nightmare. This crisis is getting worse, and just 2 weeks ago, 4 more blocks were placed on a waiting watch. They've been told there's a risk of fire, increasing their fear. They're trapped in unsellable homes, and there's a dread that at the end of all this, there's going to be an unaffordable bill for them to pay. Why can't the government understand that this continuing uncertainty and punishing of leaseholders is plain wrong, and the notion of affordability massively contentious and concerning? Perhaps we can have a meeting.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I entirely understand the concern of the Honourable Lady and of her constituents. The Government is working and working hard and at pace to remediate these buildings and resolve the issues that her constituents face. Of course, I'm very happy to meet her to discuss the specific issues in her constituency, but she can be assured that I have every sympathy with the plight of her constituents, and we are working very hard, very quickly, to make sure these issues are resolved.
We now go to Neil O'Brien.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can my right honourable friend update the House on what progress is being made in removing both ACM and non-ACM cladding in the social housing sector?
Madam Deputy Speaker, something like 97% of buildings with ACM cladding in the social sector have been remediated, or where remediation is underway. Of course, we continue to work on the remediation of non-ACM cladding, and we will work with local authorities to make sure that that is done as swiftly as possible. Another honourable member previously asked me if I would encourage housing associations to work more swiftly to remediate their properties. I think it was my right honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet. I said to her, yes, we will. I say to my honourable friend, yes, we will work harder with social housing operators to make sure that their properties are remediated.
47 withdrawn. So Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like so many colleagues across the House, I've had many constituents write to me about the problems they are suffering with the cladding and remediation, and getting some answers from both finance and insurers. So I won't repeat all of what has been said before, but could I just say to my right honourable friend that I have an outstanding meeting request with his colleague Lord Greenhalgh, and I wonder whether he might facilitate that for me. But I heard his answer a moment ago to the question about whether or not the government would look at the amendment from the House of Lords, and I listened carefully to his answer. Can you tell me whether or not the government is sympathetic, therefore, to the amendment, and whether or not the government might bring forward its own amendment that would be in order?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend encourages me to facilitate a meeting with Lord Greenhalgh. I'm happy to try to assist him in that regard, regardless of the rather Byzantine practices in the other place. I trust that we can make that happen for him. He asks whether we have sympathy with the amendment sent down to us from the House of Lords. I understand what the amendment is trying to achieve. I believe it is defective, but of course we will look at it from the point of view that another chamber in this Parliament has sent us an important amendment, and we will give it appropriate consideration.
We now go to Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I receive emails from constituents in Vauxhall on an almost daily basis about this cladding scandal. My constituent who lives at Barrigera Court on Kennington Park Road emailed me yesterday and said, I am a leaseholder, do not own any other part of the building. I had no say in how this building was built. Until recently, I didn't know what cladding was. Have just been working hard and saving for years, putting it all into a one-bedroom apartment that is now worth nothing. They bought their homes in good faith. So I have one question to the Minister. Does the government agree with me that in principle it is wrong for leaseholders to make them pay for these bills?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady, the member for Vauxhall. I know that she campaigns hard for her constituents, and we've had many exchanges across the chamber raising the concerns that her constituents have raised with her. We entirely agree that it is not right that leaseholders who have done the right thing, who have invested in a property or have chosen a place to call home, should find themselves burdened by costs for which they are not responsible. That is why we're working with the financial services sector. Michael Wade is working on this to try to make sure that any costs respecting historic defects of buildings are obviated. She will understand when I say that the taxpayer should not be held responsible for an open-ended cheque. We've already spent over £1.5 billion of public money to remediate those buildings most in need of it. The fundamental responsibility must lie with developers, but I entirely understand the point of view that the Honourable Lady has raised on behalf of her constituents. Leaseholders who have done the right thing should not fall liable to unfair costs.
David Johnston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On behalf of my constituents who are affected and anxious about this situation, can I add my voice to the cause that leaseholders should not have to pay for these charges? They've done nothing wrong. Can my right honourable friend assure me that he will push lenders to not require the EWS1 form if it isn't really needed, and also push the RICS training 2,000 other assessors to deploy those in the areas of the country that most need them, because if they're too thinly spread across the country, it won't do enough to reduce the delays?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his very thoughtful contribution. Yes, we will continue to work with the lending sector to make sure that the EWS1 form is fully and properly understood and is not misused, or the use of it bleeds across in a way that is inappropriate. We will, of course, roll out the 2,000 assessors as quickly as we possibly can, and I will take on board his point and consider how those assessors can be best and most effectively deployed.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. For the last hour and a half, the Minister has had to listen to testimony about the nightmare that all of our constituents, including mine in Leeds City Centre, are living with. He knows that leaseholders simply do not have the billions that are still going to be required to fix this problem. He knows that without funding from elsewhere, they will continue to live in unsafe homes as waking watch and insurance bills mount. He knows that some of them are eventually going to lose their homes because they will be made bankrupt by those costs. And he knows how much anguish this nightmare is causing them. Now, he also knows that an answer must be found, but I think the question leaseholders who've been listening to this urgent question would like to put to him is, when is the government going to come forward with that answer?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman. I think that the question which he puts is a fair one, and the way in which he puts it, the issues that he raises, are entirely reasonable and fair. We will bring forward proposals as quickly as we can to ensure that costs to leaseholders are mitigated. He will understand that this is a complicated issue which tracks back over political generations, and to unpick that challenge, to make sure that remediation is done effectively, to make sure that liability falls where it should, to make sure the taxpayer is not subjected to an unfunded commitment, and to make sure that leaseholders have the right thing done by them, is a challenge, but it's one we are rising to, and will bring forward proposals as quickly as we can.
Robert Neal.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister may well have seen on Sunday on the television my constituent Ritu Shah talking, not for the first time, about the agony that she and her neighbours in North Point in Bromley are going through for all the reasons that have just been set out by the right honourable member for Leeds and many others. Of course, there are complications in sorting out liability and dealing with some of the technical issues of remediation. I entirely accept that and the work that is being done there. But will the Minister also recognise that the moral point is not complicated? That at the end of the day, leaseholders who have done nothing to create this situation and who relied in good faith upon a regulation which ultimately government of whatever description owns should not be out of pocket for whatever reason. And if that takes more money, will he at least give the commitment that where it's a failure of regulation and through no fault of the leaseholder, they will not ultimately have to pick up the tab?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I have heard the testimony of Ritu Shah and others in his constituency. I understand the point that he is making. I hope that in answering him quickly, he will not think that I'm in any way diminishing the point that he is making, because it's been made, I think, by colleagues across the House. But we will work at pace to make sure that leaseholders who, through no fault of their own, find themselves in this terrible situation are not subjected to unfair costs. Costs ought to fall in the first instance to the developers and to the owners and to their warranty providers who built these properties. The government has set aside funds in this financial year to support those buildings that require immediate remediation, and there is no other means of so doing. We'll continue to keep the situation under review, but we'll work with the sector to make sure that remediation is done by those where responsibility lies.
Thank the Minister for his very comprehensive answers and the time that he stayed in the chamber.